people observed, in one particular visit, 3 groups of people were observed having picnics on the lawn beside the table. And 2 of them even brought their own furniture, which shows that there is a need and a desire for tables that are more beautiful and more comfortable to sit on, like you can see in community gardens around the area. Our final design recommendation accounts for a lack of food in the park. Given that the park is isolated from the community by the FDR, there are very few options for food in the park itself, and through public life studies, we have noted that people congregate around food and are more likely to stay situated if they are able to access it. So for this reason, we think that having food vendors in the park would add a great incentive for people to stay rather than leave to get food somewhere else. In our 50+ hours of observation at the East River Park, we only ever saw 1 food vendor. However, in 1.5 hours of observation at the Chelsea High Line, we observed 248 people standing in line for only 3 of the many food vendors at the place. Once they got their food, they sat at the tables provided near there, and many groups stayed there for a while. One group even stayed for over 45 minutes. With these design recommendations, it's important to think about some of the constraints that we've had. We haven't been able to do ethnographic studies or community surveys, even though human-centered design really focuses in on getting the word from the community. Because of a crunch timeline, we haven't had the chance to do that. It's also important that we did not sit in on any of the community engagement meetings that the ESCR itself makes. They do provide opportunities for the public to give their feedback, but we didn't get to see any of that. And we also did not prototype or test other steps of human-centered design. So while we used the idea of starting with the concerns of the users and ending with the concerns of the users, we didn't get to experiment and we didn't get to distill from those experiments just because we couldn't put a dog park in the park. We also have this constraint of lens that Iran and I have both been talking about. We've only really looked at the built infrastructure without considering opportunities for community-based organizations.
So then a few takeaways, because some of you might be thinking, what does a dog park have to do with climate resiliency and climate change? So it's important to remember that central logic that has guided our findings, which is social resiliency, first of all, is integral to climate resiliency. So climate resiliency needs that social component. And social resiliency requires strong social networks and infrastructure. So at the core of social resiliency, social networks and social infrastructure. And the built environment can and should be conducive to enhancing these social networks, which are the core to social resiliency. Human-centered design is a useful process for developing interventions that support and amplify social networks, which can lead to social resiliency. And that's why we underwent the process ourselves, although, as was mentioned, not completely. And that process matters as much as outcome. And this is perhaps one of the largest takeaways from this, is that the strength of human-centered design is that it is the process that engages with the community, and community engagement is a form of social transformation, which builds resiliency by forming those networks. So human-centered design is also a process that can be appropriated to any climate resiliency framework. So this is something that is, because it's focused on the needs and desires of users in the local context, this is something that is relevant to other cities, to villages, to different frameworks that are thinking about how to protect themselves best from the disaster that is climate change. So we would like to thank you for taking some time, and we will now facilitate some questions that you may have.